what is a new historicism and cultural materialism. As the very beginning, at the very beginning, let me make it clear that who used the term new historicism in 1972. I am going to tell you. Second thing, which are the prominent critic of new historicism and cultural materialism. What this critic do? What exactly the new historicism is all about and cultural materialism is all about? Why new historicism? What is the work of new historicist and cultural materialist? These things I am going to make it clear to you. Wesley Morris used term new historicism in 1972. Why he used the term new historicism? He used this term to designate the mode of literary criticism. The system of literary criticism, the way of literary criticism derived from the German historicists. Who are they? Critics like this and this. German historians such as Leopold von Ricke, William Dilthey, Venomiel Parringtons, he is American historian, and Van Weeks Brooks. But what Victor Shaw has already pointed out, that this new historicism, William Morris used the new term new historicism in 1972. But opposite to this, Kernan Rand has suggested that the term is foreshadowed in even earlier. Before this period, before 1972, the term was foreshadowed. In the title of Roy Harvey Pierce 1969 book, Historicism Once More. Historicism Once More. But he concedes that, he agrees that he has to agree with it, he has to concede it, he has to have a similar opinions about it, he has to give in it, that it is a Stephen Greenblatt who gave the credit for slipping the term. What is meant by slipping the term into circulation? The current, this term new historicism, all the credit is given to Stephen Greenblatt, and at the beginnings let me make it clear that in this introductions, the forms of powers and powers of forms in the Renaissance, a special issue of Zahner 1982 devoted to what was already billed as a fresh departures in the critical practice. Already existing critical practices or theorist practices, new historicism was a departure from the critical practice. And Greenblatt make it clear in his book The Forms of Powers and Powers of Forms in the Renaissance, the special issue of Zahner. I will make it later more clear later on. Nowadays the term is restricted to this later usage stemming from Greenblatt. The earlier accounts which I have talked about, the William Morris used the term new historicism, why he used new historicism, which critics were included in that, German Americans, some critics, and before that Harvey Pierce books in 1969, Historicism Once More. These are the other things. But Nowadays, the term is restricted to the letter usage stemming from Greenbald, describing the grouping of critics and theorists. What these theorists? He was talking about the some critics and theorists, group of critics and theorists who have rejected the synchronic approaches. What is mean by synchronic approach? We will study it. It is important for us to talk about the synchronic approach, but we will have to talk about it, because synchronic approach, what is a diachronic approach and synchronic approach, this we will study later on. Synchronic approaches to cultures and literature associated with the structuralism, who have attempted to provide more adequate answer to various problems associated with the tensions between the aesthetics, cultural and historical approaches to the study of range of different sort of text. We will talk about synchronic and diachronic approach of structuralism little later, after this lecture, later on in a separate lecture. As it is very clear that nowadays the term is restricted to the later usage of stemming from Greenbald and describing the groupings of critics and theorists who have rejected the synchronic approaches to cultures and literature associated with the structuralism, and who have attempted to provide more adequate answer to various problems associated with the tension between aesthetics, cultural and historical approaches to the study of range of different sort of text. As we know, there are different types of text or book. In order to read them, some critics read it for the pleasure, to take pleasure from the text. Other read it in order to know the culture, or some other read from the historical approach, that what was the history of that time, what was the background of that time. There was different types of text, range of different sort of text that are read from the different approaches, historical, cultural, aesthetics, and these all approaches are different from one another. Now, the most of those known as a new historicist, some of whom have gone on record with their preference for the term cultural poetics, are from North America, while cultural materialism is by and large a British phenomenon. As we know that cultural materialism is a British phenomenon by and largely, or in toto, or to some of it is in totality it is British phenomenon. On occasion, however, new historicism is used as an umbrella term. We will also talk about what is umbrella term. As an umbrella term to include the member of both groupings. Historicism is used as umbrella term to include members of both groupings. Both grouping, that is historicism and the cultural materialism. These are both grouping. Now, writings of Michel Foucault and Raymond Williams constitute a major influence on the historicists, who have succeeded in defining new objects of historical study with the particular emphasis upon the ways in which causal influence are mediated through their discursive practices. Causal influences. I repeat, who have succeeded in defining new historicists who have succeeded in defining or suggesting new object of historical study, with a particular emphasis upon what new historicists give the emphasis upon, ways in which causal influence are mediated through the discursive practices. When any text which is discussed, whatever text is being discussed in any text, the causal influences, new historicism give more emphasis upon the causal influences. Now, the Stephen Greenwald's certainly a key figures of the rise of new historicism, and in his collections of essay Learning to Curse, as we know that when we were talking about, we will talk about post-colonialism. One of the prime example of what we can call that, the Tempest from Shakespeare's Tempest, where Prospero was taught the language, and he knows the language by which how to curse, to give curse. That was how the learning to curse in the 1990s. He admitted that for him the term described not so much a set of beliefs as a trajectory that led to the American literary formalism, though the political or theoretical firmaments in the 1970s to the fascinations with what one of the best new historicist critic, Louis A. Montrose, called a historicity of text and textuality of history. What Louis Montrose mean by historicity of the text and textuality of history? He means that every text requires its history, and every history, in order to understand the history of any text, we need to know its textuality, and histories of textuality and textuality of history. That is why he used this term, used this quote. Elsewhere he describes that new historicism as a practice rather than a doctrine. What he says, that it is not a doctrines or decree or the principles, rather it is a practice everywhere. It is a practice, it is implemented, it is being used, and therefore it is not only a theory form. Greenwald says that new historicism creations an intensified willingness to read all the textual traces of the past with the attention traditionally confers upon the literary text. What Greenwald says, the new historicism creations of an intensified willingness and full-fledged willingness and the emphasized willingness to read all the textual traces. Whenever we want to understand any text, we have to find the textual traces of different books in order to know the history of that text, and thereby we can understand the culture, we can understand way of life, we can understand their way of living, lifestyle, their decorum, their etiquette, their mannerism, their whole life in toto. Thus, in a study of design by Durer for the monuments to commemorate the defeat of peasant involved in the protest and rebellion, thus in the study of a design by Durer for a monument to commemorate the defeat of peasant involved in protest and rebellion, one of the writers, whose name is Durer, he commemorates the defeat of peasants who were involved in the protest and rebellion. Greenwald notes that intentions, genres and historical situation all have to be taken into account as all are social and ideological and must be involved in any readings of design. He continues. What he continues? The productions and consumptions of such works are not unitary to begin with. They always involve a multiplicity of interest. As we know that if we read the history, we will find the writing of historicists, we will find the history, some will emphasize on the cultural aspect, some other will pay more attention to the legal aspects, some other writers will pay more about the way of life and lifestyles and the different orientations of the people of that era. Therefore, every books in every different era talks about the differentiation or the different aura or different sides or different approach of the life or a particular things. However, well organized, for the crucial reason, the art of social and hence presume more than one consciousness. See, every person has a different opinion about the different thing. One single things, different person have a different opinion about one single thing, and that is why everyone differs from the other's opinion. It doesn't mean that one is correct and other is wrong. It doesn't mean that. But they look by different perspective, that is why they look through the different approach, and therefore it looks to them like it. Therefore, what is right and what is wrong, it is not our point, but to study the different approaches and and thereby we understand what exactly the situation of that text and historicity of its. Whether we wish to or not, the shift in values and interest are produced in the struggle of social and political life. The new historicist, in other words, has much to say about the readings of text, about the composition. For those who like the negative definitions, Greenwald cites the definitions of the word historicism from the American Heritage Dictionary, all which he sees to be counter the practice of new historicism. The beliefs that the processes are at work in history and that man can do little to alter. The first thing, we will talk about the three things, but first of all, the beliefs that the possesses are at works in history, that man can do little to alter. Man cannot alter the historicity because different people talk the different aspect, and thereby we can understand its totality. And through the totality cannot be a belief. It could be reality, it could be actuality, or it can be the fact or factuality. And second things, we will talk about that theory that historians must avoid all value judgments in his study of past period of former cultures. The history that historian must avoid, what historian must avoid, what they should elude, that what they should evade, what they should separate. All value judgment, they should not talk about the value judgment. Value judgment is not conducive, it is not beneficial, it is not recommendatory in his history of the past period of formal culture, in order to understand that. And third things, the veneration, what we call in English, other words in English we call it the respect or the honors or honorific words for the past of tradition. Everyone has a veneration or the regards for the past. That's what American Heritage Dictionary describes. As we were talking about the American Heritage Dictionary, although Greenblatt and other new historicists, what I mean Louis Montrose, other historicists, paid tribute to the works of the various post-structuralist, anti-formalist elements in their works clearly distances them from the important aspect of post-structuralism. How they are different, Greenblatt and Montrose and other new historicists, how they are different from the post-structuralist, anti-formalist, though these are the part of the post-modernism or the post-structuralism, anti-formalism elements, and they are different from the post-structuralism. How they are different? Let us see. The term new historicist, is sometimes used to pejorative sense. Pejorative sense? In a different sense. You should know the meanings of the pejorative, which is unconnected with historicism, new historicism. Historicist, in this sense, implies the view that human, social or cultural characteristics are determined in the absolute sense by historical situation. Historicism, in this sense, is thus a form of reductionism, as the human and social and the cultural are the collapse back into historicism. Thus the title of an essay by Louis Althusser, Marxism is not historicism, rests on such a definition of historicism, what we were talking about, that historicist is sometimes used in pejorative sense. Why it is used in pejorative sense? Because it is unconnected with historicism, new historicism. Historicist in this sense or in this manner or in this meaning implies what it implies, what it says, though it is not directly say, but it says with implication that new use that human, social or cultural characteristic, cultural characteristic are determined in the absolute sense by the historical situation. What was the situations of particular era? What was the situations of the farmer? What was the situations of bureaucrat? What was situations of politician? These all are determined by what historical situation. If we talk about the history, if we are talking about the culture, way of life, the traditions, convention of 16th century, whether about the Indian society or whether it is a British society, very little right were conveyed to women. And that is why if we were talking about that women were free to vote or they were have given the franchise or there was publicized, it was not like that. People were not valuing others' opinions, other judgments. Those who have powers only were what we can call that the mighty, those who were mighty, those who were powerful, only power were concentrated in them. That is what is the historical situation. Historicism in this sense is thus the form of reductionism, as the human, the social and cultural are collapsed back into historical. Thus the title of an essay by Louis Althusser, Marxism is not historicism. What Louis Althusser says, that Marxism is not the historicism. Why Marxism is not historicism? We will talk about it later. Rest on such a definition that historicism, Graham Holderness, has produced useful checklist of what he considered to be the difference between cultural materialism and new historicism, mainly North American new historicism. Accordingly to him, cultural materialism. What is the cultural materialism? though these two terms is intricately very closely associated with each other, but still there is some distinction between historicism and the cultural materialism. What he says, Graham Holderness, his opinion we are talking about here, that he says, he goes on to say, or he quotes that, accordingly to him, I am using the different word in order to make it understandable to you, is much more concerned to engage with the contemporary cultural practice, whereas New Historicism confines its focus of the attention to the past. See, cultural materialism is much more concerned to engage with contemporary cultural practice. Let me give you an example. If suppose Shakespeare used in his play Women's, men were playing the role of women in his play, because women were not allowed in those days to work in a play or movie. There was no movie as such, but play dramas and this folk dance. There was not women's. That we can understand the cultural practices of those time. Contemporary, everywhere we know that women had very restricted rights in those days. But whereas it is the cultural materialism, culture of that contemporary era, then it is part of cultural materialism. And second parts, which is the New Historicism, what it says, it confines its focus, it gives its focus, it restricts its focus only to the past, only past. Cultural materialism can overtly, even stridently, very strictly, very compulsorily, very mandatorily. I cannot use the word mandatory, very mandatory or very compulsory. These two words which I recently used, not recently, just used, are completely wrong. Polemical about its political implication, where New Historicism tend to efface them. What New Historicism tend to subvert them, turn to obliterate them, turn to erase them. Cultural materialism partly derives its theory and method from the kind of cultural criticism exemplified by Raymond Williams, and though that heritage stretches its roots into British traditions of Marxism, cultural analysis, and hence into the wider movement for socialist educations and emancipation. New Historicism has no sense of corresponding political legacy, nothing to do with the political legacy, and takes its intellectual bearings, intellectual standings, intellectual stand-up directly from the post-structuralist, theoretical and philosophical model. It is largely takes its ideas from post-structuralism, whether it is a theoretical or whether it is a philosophical model. Both these things borrowed from or taken from, or it already I have told that it is standing or it is bearing directly on the post-structuralism. That is why it is cultural materialism aspects as appropriate object of inquiry a very wide range of textual materialism. The New Historicism concern itself principally with the narrower definitions of the textual with what has been written. Clearly then, both terms denote relatively loosely define schools which approach literary texts contextually. Not so Beckens has pointed out, what he pointed out, that term his cultural materialism emerged independently in two different academic contexts. It has a two different academic context situations, but it is completely dependent from the new historicism. As she explained, Marvin Harris applied the name cultural materialism. Who used this term? Marvin Harris. Is a scientific method of studying the interactions between the social and material condition. Interactions between the social life and material condition. What is social life of society, as well as what is their conditions, way of living, in which situation they are living or they are forced to live. In literary studies, however, the term has a rather different ancestry. It has its forefathers or its its inheritance, ancestral ancestors, as it owes not just its theories and methods of Raymond Williams, but also its name. In his essay Notes on Marxism in Britain since 1945, Williams gives an interesting account of his intellectual journey, which culminated in cultural materialism for him. It took me 30 years. Let me quote it. Who Notes on Marxism in Britain since 1945. Williams gives. Who is William? Raymond Williams I'm talking. Who is a Marxist critic. And what he interesting talk about the intellectual journey which culminated in the cultural materialism for him. As we know, the Raymond Williams, who is a Marxist critic, and he is a Marxist, but he talks about the cultural materialism. He goes on to tell us that it took me 30 years in a very complex process to move from received Marxist theory, cultural theory from Engels and through the Perkins, Fox, Caldwell's, West, and also Zenow, Zayach, which is its most general form. I begin by accepting those various transition forms of theory and inquiry to the positions I now hold, which I define as a cultural materialism. The emphasis of their traditions on the productions rather than only the reproductions of the meanings and values by the specific social formations, on the centrality of the language and communication. As William tells us that it took him 30 years. It was a very complex process because receive Marxist of theory from cultural theory from Engels through Perkins, Fox, Caldwell's, West, and also Zenow, Zayach. In general forms, I may begin accepting those various transition from theories and inquiries. Transition, there is always change in the forms and theories, because society is a not static thing. It is always dynamic, always a transitional, always required change, and to the positions I now hold, which I define as cultural materialism. Therefore, I am telling that cultural material. If the cultural were statics, that no need to talk about the cultural materialism, because if we say the cultural is statics, that human being is never a static human being. It's always bring changes in their way of life, their cultural beliefs, their history, because man, I'm not saying that. This is not my word. But this is a truth that a human being, whatever is conducive for him or her, they change it to make their life easygoing. The emphasis of the traditions on the productions of meanings and values by specific social formations, on the centrality of language and communication as formations of social forces, and on the complex interactions, both the institutions and the forms and the social relations and the formal conventions may be defined, if anyone wishes, as the culturism.